Here we unwrap this fine little brass scale car, take a look at Litchfield, Minnesota on the GN in 1970 and see how it's progressing, as well as seeing the final outcome of that MN&S truck, only on this episode of Soo the Milwaukee Road. Today we're going to take a look at scale test cars. Now this is GN X845. The Great Northern actually had a pair of these that lasted beyond the 1950s. In fact, they made it the 1970s. These were built in 1929, so it's kind of cool to have something that lasted that long to be able to model on your railroad. Now I wanted to find these in HO scale. I realized that Walthers made them, but I also thought it'd be cool to do one in brass. I ended up finding one made by Sunset Models. This is going to be factory painted in black, and they did a lot of amazing detail on them. Now if we look at them here, they have decals. They got them wrapped up real nice. As I mentioned before, it is black. Now Jeff Lemke, who's painted Overland models and also knows a lot about the Great Northern, he noted that these things are actually Pullman green. So I want to make sure the color's right. So I figured I'd strip this thing. Now you got to take all these little pesky parts. There's a ton of screws on the bottom. Now as I mentioned the detail on these, the air hose that runs through, it's an actual rubber air hose. Little overkill, but it's definitely cool. The door on the side even opens. Why you want to open the door? Not sure, but it's an excellent little detail. Now I do use wash away when I strip the paint off of these. If I don't have wash away, I end up using isopropyl alcohol. Both of them will do a similar job as far as stripping the paint off. I drop it in, make sure it's fully submerged, and go back to those pesky little parts. I throw them into a Ziploc bag. You don't want to lose any of them. Now looking at the wheels, these are 36-inch wheels. I might put intermountain wheels because they have silver treads. One thing when dealing with brass, you got to make sure those insulators are on the right side. See them on the end there, that little tiny ring around the inside? If you don't do it, it's going to short. I actually let them set in the vat, and probably about a half hour, 45 minutes to soften the paint. Scrub it all clear. I'm going to work on this a little bit more, but we'll look at a little history while we wait. All right, well, you think about that little quiz question there. I want you to take a look at the Litchfield, Minnesota. This is the pop-out section I've got for my dad's railroad. My dad is the GN in 1970. This particular piece actually sits over the top of the helix, and there's a lot going on here, and right now I'm actually kind of working on the streets, but I've melted the foam, and we'll kind of talk about that in a moment. But the biggest thing was the actual streets themselves. How are they laid out? How does the city lay out? What is actually happening here? I know this group of cars I got sitting here, I'm kind of thinking it's either going to be an auto repair shop or I want to do a little dealership, so you've got some new used cars. One thing to think about with cars is the actual function in the town. Can this car pull in, back in, and park in its spot and make it actually practical? Look at the foam here. I ended up using a hot knife to be able to cut it across. I used a little bit too much, a couple areas it dips down, but I'll kind of file those out to get it right. Now I mentioned the hot knife. This is how I end up using it. Thing gets blazing hot and you can just kind of carve away as you go. I ended up picking this up at Menards. It was only like 20 bucks. It is not fantastic in terms of high quality. It's just tool shop, but for 20 bucks, it does what I need it to do. The other thing I did here is cut out this piece of masonite that serves actually as the height of the curb, but it also lets us lift this out. So we can lift it out. You can work on it on the workbench, or I can take it home and work on it at my house and then bring it back and drop it back onto the railroad. So think of those type of things. Not everything has to be glued in. I'm not going to glue the buildings in either. I am going to set it up so they can sit on some posts. But at the end of the day, I still want the ability to remove buildings, to detail them. Maybe I find another one that looks better, and I can just update that particular location. The one thing to talk about here is the curb. I end up filing this curb down so it actually meshes with the road a little bit nicer. I test it with a piece of styrene to see the thickness of the road. And I end up having to look at too is the curve. There's those little curves that go out onto the street. I'm going to file those away. I think they end up turning out pretty good. Now you can see where the cars now are going to be able to back out and then pull back out on the street. There's that little bit of a taper there. It'd be kind of a nice transition. I also look at too is the distance of the building from the curb. And I'm using this piece of styrene that just has some marks on it. And I end up using a scale ruler to identify exactly how far back it's sitting. I think in this particular case, I'm sitting about 5 feet back. Now this scale ruler, if you don't have one, you can print it out on the internet. Looked it up, typed in 1/87th scale rule. This prints out. You can check it with a ruler to make sure that 1 inch matches up with 1 inch. But we're looking at here is 0 to 10 feet. As I mentioned before, this is about 5 feet. Gives me an idea as far as where a building is sitting to the curb. Now, I also want to be able to take the buildings out, as I mentioned before. I actually file up these little posts, and this post is actually tapered, so when I actually set the building down, it actually helps it sit nice and square. I end up marking these by using an old piece of the building, and that actually gives me the wall thickness, because obviously I'm not tracing inside the building. Trace this one here, and now I've got a corner that I'm able to set these posts on. Now I make them really snug, but I use tight bond. It's actually quick and thick. Big thing is, it's a no-run glue. That's fantastic. If you're gluing anything together, this has been one of my favorite glues to use for these type of projects. Just put a little bit on. I end up setting it right inside the mark that I just made. And before the glue completely sets, I end up setting the building over the top of this to be able to make sure that it sits exactly where I want it. So I just slide it on, it's nice and snug, and it's going to be perfect when I'm able to lift it off in a little bit. All right, what year did the GN build GNX 846? Was it 1959, 1929, or 1938? If you guessed 1929, ding, 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 you're the winner. All right, here it is, all cleaned up, got it all ready for paint. I ended up washing it up with some dish soap. And remember I mentioned that these details, the door opens and closes. The hatch also opens and closes, which is cool too. I added an additional cut lever on the ends. I took off the ones that they had. They're a little bit kind of flimsy and weren't doing exactly what I needed. I do use Tamiya primer, and that's what I ended up spraying up on this. So now I got to be able to create some decals and find some good Pullman green paint. Well, while that stuff is all being taken care of for the scale car, I wanted to take a look at this MN&S stake bed truck. This is the one I mentioned early on that I was working on. I saw this photo by Vern Wigfield and thought, man, I've got to create that in 187th. So I started looking around. How can I find that cab? Well, Greg Dixon pointed this one out and said, this is a Chevy. The one you're looking at is a GMC, but it's close enough. And I thought, boy, isn't he right? I end up chopping up an Athearn chassis. I end up casting my own tank. Start to slowly chip away at adding some of those details, painting up the wheels and that sort of thing. I did use the ultraviolet light for the lights on top of the cab. You can actually notice the rise of the lights, and that's created by that Bondic ultraviolet light resin. So here we go with just a little bit more of the detail, going from that white cast to what we've got here. And again, Greg Dixon, a huge thanks to you for pointing this out, because you took this prototype photo and allowed me to be able to create something that I had a good time building, and this is the end product. The final truck itself, I did add the Plano mirrors, I did add the license plate. I ended up putting a couple of, I forget who, if it's MV Products that does the headlights. Those are just jewels. And the beacon on top is actually from a U-boat. I believe it's a Proto 2000 U-boat. The visor inside is a Details West visors that are meant for F units or locomotives. Windshield wipers are Plano as well. Again, I cast the tank. The board that's on the side, that actually just came off of just a sprue or an extra piece of material that was left over from another project. And again, at the end of the day, it's all about the modeling. I appreciate those guys that have provided information, from Vern Wigfield that had the prototype photo, to Greg Dixon that had the cab suggestion, to even Mike Buddy, who ended up pointing out how to cast items. I watched his YouTube or Facebook video that he had on casting, and it's not as difficult as it looks. It's the first time I'd ever done it, and I think it turned out all right. And again, at the end of the day, if you're enjoying these videos, please share it with other people. Feel free to subscribe or tell others to subscribe to this channel. Hopefully we can continue creating some cool content, and anybody that has any questions, comments, or concerns, feel free to reach out to me at any time. And I hope you're enjoying these episodes of Soo the Milwaukee Road. Take care.